They are the artists who put the pop in American pop. Marvin Gaye, The Platters, Van Morrison, Tom Jones, the Everly Brothers, Ray Charles, Dionne Warwick, Jose Feliciano, Willie Nelson, James Brown. This is the series that goes backstage and tells the stories of those who entered the recording studio and created gold. This is Music Legends, and you've got a seat at front and center.
Marvin Gaye, that's an amazing story, a great story, but, you know, of course, ultimately a really sad story. I think by now most people remember or, know how tragically it ended for him, but I don't think people know how it started.
The success that Marvin Gaye had was just gigantic. He was a superstar. And the pain that he had in his heart for most of his life was also enormous.
When you're doing music, a lot of things from your past are brought out. And all these elements that he had working from his background were in his music, all these things from the soul.
With Marvin Gaye, you had these wars between the head and the heart. He was a guy that was conflicted between being a social commentator and a pop star.
The music of Marvin Gaye was actually the story of Marvin Gaye. It was really autobiographical.
You have to look at this guy in all three of his eras to get a full measure of not just who he was, but what he did.
Here we have this man in the 60s, a fabulous sex symbol. By the 70s, he became a huge star. And in the 80s, he just became an incredibly mature artist.
He was a great American product. I mean, you can't get more American than being born in the Capitol.
Born in Washington, D.C., 1939, April 2nd. It was a young family back then. Pretty soon it grew into a very big family.
He was the oldest son of a very charismatic preacher. Storefront preachers were preachers that would preach anywhere, as long as they had bodies and a space.
Ultimately, there would be 4 kids in that family, Marvin, his brother, and he had 2 sisters.
He was Marvin Gaye Jr. They spelled their names differently. His father spelt it with G-A-Y, and Marvin, for whatever reason, decided to add an E on it. When Marvin was a young boy, his father had started an actual church.
He comes from a background where there is a performance every Sunday. Musical background, of course, stemmed out of the church. I mean, and it just gave him a platform to launch his career.
That really, I think, shaped Marvin.
It was a very, very strict church. There was no drinking, no dancing. There are a lot of very strong rules.
You didn't play fast and loose with the church rules if you were a child of Marvin Gaye Sr.
Because of his dad's church, he had a really strange childhood.
Marvin Gaye Sr.'s kids were really looked at as strange. The father's church and his preachings caused great stress for Marvin.
During that time, there's no real money coming into the home from church. I mean, Marvin Gaye Sr. being a pastor and all, it was just more a community thing that he did.
The only real breadwinner in the family was Marvin's mother. It was another one of the many things that Marvin Gaye Jr. had to deal with growing up that really upset him, having to watch his mother make most of the money in the family.
Some biographies say that Marvin Gaye Sr. rarely worked when he wasn't preaching. He was a very defiant guy.
Marvin Gaye's dad was actually very highly educated. He was something of a scholar, but he was also very violent.
If they were out of line in any way, they would immediately get a beating.
If you messed up in his house, you paid for it.
When Marvin grew up, he rebelled against it.
There are many accounts of what went on, probably because of his rebellious nature, and he was pretty rebellious on more than one occasion.
With all that that crap going on at home. You'd think that Marvin would have been really happy to get away and get into school.
So here he is. He's got no high school diploma and no serious love or knowledge of music at all at this point.
In those days, if you quit school, you had to do something, so Marvin elected to join the Air Force. Joining the Air Force was not exactly the best move that Marvin could have made at that time.
You have to understand, Marvin Gaye is a trendsetter. He's not about following the rules. So, I mean, to think that, he didn't follow the rules in school. I don't know what made him think he was going to follow the rules in the military.
He wanted everybody to know that he was discharged from the Air Force in a very honorable way.
His discharge said right on it, he had a problem with regimentation and authority.
After he was in the Air Force, he hooked up with a couple of guys. By the time he met Covey and Stewart, he started to figure it out. He should sing. He should be a singer.
Billy Stewart and Don Covey had a rhythm and blues act, which they called the Rainbows. With Marvin starting to sing with the Rainbows, it gained him a lot of confidence and taught him really how to be a performer.
The one thing that he did have going for him was, his voice. It was silky smooth, and of course, a lot of this came from the fact that he was singing gospel in the church.
So he sang with the Rainbows up until about the mid-50s, I believe. Although the Rainbows were never a professional group that was ever going to really make it big, they were a great training ground for the young Marvin Gaye.
In 1957, he joined a group called the Marquis. They were a lot closer to the big time than the Rainbows. When he met up with the Marquis, they were just getting their shot at stardom.
Two big things about the Marquis back then: they were recording on a big label and with Bo Diddley. Bo Diddley was one of those rare guys who crossed over from the raw blues era into the commercial recording world.
Bo Diddley taught him so much about the music industry, and in particular about how the music industry works.
On the Chess label in the mid-1950s, Bo Diddley was huge. In 1951, Chess put out Rocket 88, which many historians think was about the first rock and roll record ever.
A lot of big artists on the Chess label at that time.
Just like Smokey, they both recorded in a group, but you could tell these guys were going to be solo.
In 1958, a singer-producer named Harvey Fuqua ostensibly took over the entire management. Harvey had a lot of experience working for the label, and then they finally gave him control of the Marquis.
Before the Marquis, Harvey Fuqua actually had another doo-wop group called the Moonglows. The Moonglows had a lot of different singers that were there, and they went through a lot of different incarnations.
So Harvey took the Marquis and he transformed them into the new and improved Moonglows. With Marvin Gaye and the guys from the Marquis, these guys were great. They were perfect American bandstand material.
The Moonglows had an incredible sound, and they were the quintessential five-part harmony.
You have to think about his music and his background to realize how conflicted Marvin Gaye really was. When you think of that generation, it's really interesting. We look at the 60s and we think about sexual freedom, but look back at the 50s. The 50s brought us rock and roll, and at the same time, it brought us musical censorship. You've got two wars just raging in there.
That way of thinking was very new at the time, in the 50s, but just imagine what that must have been like for the way Marvin was raised.
And Marvin grew up in this family where women weren't doo-wop fantasies. They had specific stations in life.
Sexuality was not something that you could think about, talk about, let alone sing about.
In the home and in the church of Marvin Gaye Sr., you didn't see women the way you saw them in the Moonglows.
People figure, yeah, but everybody went through that in the 50s, but I doubt that they had his childhood and his early success.
This combination of a repressed adolescent and a free musical life really is what shaped Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye knew just how good he was and how ahead of the curve he was, and how much greater it would be down the road.
Getting back to the Moonglows, when you realize what Marvin Gaye truly needed in his life, although it came along later, I think Harvey was the father that Marvin Gaye really wanted. Fuqua was really, really patient with Marvin. He taught him how to make transitions within a very, very difficult industry.
When they broke up, it was Harvey and Marvin that stayed together and made their next move together.
Detroit was now the place where all the new sounds were being created, and Harvey Fuqua knew this. He told Marvin there's only one place to be as this new movement took place in the music world.
One of the great moves was Harvey brought Marvin Gaye to Detroit, where he introduced him to Berry Gordy, who was just starting Motown. For those acts that were tired of the games that most record companies played, the introduction of Motown was like a new awakening.
When he saw Motown, he knew this is it. This is the place. It was the place to be. It was what was happening. It was new. It was fresh. And Marvin Gaye just knew that he just had to be a part of it. He wanted it.
Marvin Gaye didn't simply just want in with Motown. He wanted into Berry Gordy's family. He met this woman, fell in love with her, and I guess it really didn't hurt at all that she was Berry Gordy's sister.
She was, about 17 years older than him. They had a real age difference, but she was a beautiful woman and he was a diamond in the rough.
And now Marvin Gaye had a brother-in-law who was about to be the biggest guy in pop music. It seemed like all of the pieces were in the right place at the right time for everybody.
As great as it was the signing of Marvin Gaye, Berry Gordy really had a problem because he really didn't know what to do with Marvin. There's an immediate disconnect between what Motown wanted and what Marvin Gaye wanted.
Berry Gordy signed Marvin to a huge, huge long-term contract. Family ties or not, he knew Marvin was just such a great talent and he had to have him in his collage of performers.
But Motown did something that nobody had been able to do before. They were able to sell black music to white teenagers. What Motown did in that time was unprecedented. They broke all kinds of barriers.
Marvin Gaye didn't see himself as a teen act. He saw himself as Nat King Cole selling sophisticated music to sophisticated people. Having come from doo-wop, Marvin Gaye saw that the next logical step would be the next big lounge singer.
Berry Gordy wasn't in the business of recording singers who drank a martini and sang old love songs. He would take these doo-wop sound groups and make them sound exactly like they were Motown.
It's interesting considering Marvin Gaye's background because he had this uncanny ability to do, I would say, almost probably Gershwin type music, but it really just didn't fit into the style that Motown was headed towards.
Even though in those days, it really was a mismatch between Marvin Gaye and Motown, but Berry Gordy was smart. He let Marvin record what he wanted. Berry Gordy probably crossed his fingers and just thought, well, you know, he's young, he's very talented. Eventually he'll come around to the Motown way of thinking.
They tried to crack into the sophisticated adult market, but they didn't have much luck. Gordy told him to stop being Sinatra. Marvin said, you better market better. But in the end, it is what it is.
The good news is there were plenty of role models back then in Motown, just so many people he could study. Marvin Gaye was a brilliant guy, stubborn but brilliant, and he wanted to be a star. So if he wanted to be a star, he knew he had to adapt.
Marvin saw the success that Berry had with Mary Wells, the Marvelettes, just any number of those groups. Motown, if you looked at the acts that they had there then, was the who's who of pop music.
Motown was like a school back then, and even though he wasn't Nat King Cole, Marvin was working. As Marvin and Berry started to progress in their relationship as in music, they started to put the lounge singer Marvin aside and concentrate more on what was next.
Marvin Gaye was a great singer, great writer, great drummer, which a lot of people don't remember. So he showed up on a lot of Motown products. He worked constantly. Marvin Gaye actually did a lot of the drumming on some of the early records like Little Stevie Wonder.
Confident in his own abilities and seeing how other acts had made it, Marvin put two and two together. Ultimately, he became very realistic about what he had to do to succeed.
He put aside this dream to be a great lounge singer. He was here in this place that combined great rock with rhythm and blues. And he was lucky. He could play, sing, and write, so he was able to take matters into his own hands.
He took it on himself to write a pop hit song, which he called "The Stubborn Kind of Fellow." That song was big for him. It made it into the top 10 and put him on the map.
Talk about a song to come from Marvin Gaye. I mean, that song does seem quite autobiographical. The style of that song was something that he would cling to for the next 3 or 4 years.
A Stubborn Kind of Fellow was a great hit, and it kind of showed that he could touch the young Americans. Because of that song, he was suddenly seen as a smooth soul figure, but somebody who could make people dance.
Stubborn Kind of Fellow was a big album that year, but that wasn't the only hit Marvin Gaye worked on that year. Now that he was becoming known, he felt more confident about helping other people in Motown.
Pride and Joy, that was another 1962 hit, and he definitely played a part in making that happen. One day he'd be writing a song for someone else, the next day he'd be, I don't know, singing, playing drums on somebody else's track.
Can I Get a Witness in 1962 was a massive hit. How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You is one of the great songs.
I'll Be Doggone, it just had a really simple, accessible title, easy to remember. Actually, I'll Be Doggone went to #1, and Marvin was quickly becoming the #1 arsenal in terms of performers in the Motown lineup.
There was another song called Ain't That Peculiar, so he was kept pretty busy during that time. Ain't That Peculiar became so popular that he actually went out and recorded cover versions of popular Broadway songs.
A lot of people don't really know that he was also a writer on Dancing in the Street.
Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, I think, were the first people to make that standard into a hit. Bottom line, he quickly went from being Berry Gordy's problem to being Berry Gordy's moneymaker.
At that point now, he became a huge artist at Motown. He could write, he could sing, it was just beginning. From his hits, Marvin Gaye was starting to come off as a ladies' man, and this led to the next stage of his career.
Motown wanted to do a string of duets during that time, and Marvin Gaye did quite a few.
With Mary Wills, he did a duet called What's the Matter with You, Baby? But he also did a few others with her. In 1964, Mary Wells left Motown, so he started doing he started doing duets with other female singers of the time.
Diana Ross and Marvin Gaye worked well together when they did It Takes Two. He also did duets with Kim Weston. They worked together through 1967.
Motown had a team of songwriters creating duets, constantly for Tammy Terrell and Marvin Gaye.
Tammy Terrell and Marvin Gaye had one hit after another when they sang together. The team that wrote for them was Ashford and Simpson, who later became stars themselves.
When you put Marvin Gaye together with Tammy Terrell along with Ashford and Simpson, it's just interesting how his solo career just seemed to be eclipsed by a career as a duet type singer.
Tragically, Tammy Terrell had a brain tumor in 1968. She actually collapsed in his arms on stage and died 2 years later.
When he finally got over the passing of Tammy Terrell, Marvin started working with a writer-producer named Norman Whitfield. Whitfield inherited a difficult situation. He had to get Marvin off that terrible depression.
Norman Whitfield probably eclipsed Harvey as being such an influence on Marvin's career. 1970 had to probably be a really, really tough time for Marvin. I mean, Tammy dying and all. And Whitfield was more than patient, because he literally had to wait for Marvin to come out of seclusion.
When Norman Whitfield and Marvin Gaye finally started working together, believe me, it wasn't all lovey-dovey. They were combative and combustible. Whitfield was already a very successful songwriter, and like most songwriters, or certainly like most good songwriters, he butted heads with the singers.
Marvin married Berry Gordy's sister, and the marriage wasn't going very well, and the songs of Whitfield reflected that. When Marvin Gaye and Whitfield made I Heard It Through the Grapevine, everybody thought that song was about Anna.
Even though it sings melodically, it's like filled with pain and anguish and anger. And how can you not draw those parallels to think that it's not about his first marriage?
His voice on Grapevine was unique. It was brand new. It was something we hadn't heard before, and very, very successful. But I wonder what it was from. Was it the problems with his marriage or something else? We don't know.
By the start of the 70s, Marvin Gaye was sort of an independent player. I mean, he knew what he wanted with his career. He was a Motown player, he was a duet king, and Grapevine came and changed it all.
Even though he had help from Whitfield, he was now producing for himself, writing for himself, setting his own course. Grapevine made him solo again. His rocky marriage made him solo again. I mean, he was really independent at that point.
The marriage was so troubled that, Marvin Gaye was kind of ostracized and not a part of the Gordy family anymore. So all of these problems, all the angst and fear and sadness that he had was preparing him for his next big project.
As Marvin's career progressed, his next album showed that not only did he have a great voice, but that he was a great songwriter and that he was going to be a force in the music industry. When Marvin's next album came out, it took the industry by storm. Everybody was surprised by this.
You know, Marvin Gaye wrote a lot of songs, but none of them were like his great concept album, What's Going On. That was new. That was special. What's Going On is one of those albums that's all about the moment. It's relevant to just the time it came out.
Look at 1971. The war, race riots, feminism, ecology. On TV back then, you went from My Three Sons to All in the Family. Marvin Gaye went from love ballads to real hard work.
That album was an absolute landmark in pop music, if not all pop culture. It was about Vietnam, it was about religion, it was about the ghetto, it was about anything and everything that mattered.
He did his first concept album, What's Going On, and that was a major smash and led him to start to do other concept albums. You know, it wasn't just the subject matter that made this radical, it was the music itself was very complex.
It didn't just take people by storm, it just literally just like etched him in as not just a performer, but someone who could just like write about political and social issues and do it in a way that was like, it's not so much that it just brought issues to light, but it made people talk about it. After What's Going On and several other concept albums, a lot of people started to see Marvin Gaye not just as a performer, but as a person who just made the issues of the day something that the American public needed to address.
Sexuality and free love were great topics of the time, but they just simply did not prepare his audience for Let's Get It On. What's Going On was very relevant to world affairs and what was going on at the time with teenagers in particular, made everybody think and question their values and so forth. Just as Let's Get It On made everybody think about sex.
He was 33 when he did Let's Get It On, and that was about the time that he met Janice.
Janice Hunter was 16 when they met, and I think he was something like, 32, 33. He had 3 years with Anna and the Gordy family, and now he meets this girl that turns out to be his great love.
Marvin and Janice had two kids, a young boy, Frankie, and Nora, who turned out to be a very good singer. You know, he was still married to Anna when Janice Hunter had two of his children.
Marvin and Anna did finally divorce, but during their marriage, they adopted a son, Marvin Gaye III. Even into 1976, Marvin Gaye was still making sexual albums. I Want You was one of those albums.
In 1977, Got to Give It Up was very relevant as a disco hit because that's what was popular then, disco. Got to Give It Up was about his own personal shyness and difficulty in dancing.
The 2-album set that came out in 1978 wasn't just epic in size, it was epic in emotion. The double album was called Here, My Dear, and it was all about the decay of his marriage to Anna Gordy.
One track on that album, When Did You Stop Loving Me? When Did I Stop Loving You? A long title, but great track. That song had to have double meaning for him. It was just about the time he was breaking up with Janice.
Those 2 albums, one about his life, one about his work, looked like it was going to be the end of Marvin Gaye. By then he became very reclusive and withdrawn, and even told some of his close friends that he thought he was going to quit music.
As the 80s began, Marvin Gaye still had one more album to do for Motown, and in our lifetime, I believe was that album.
Most Americans thought when he left for London, he was gone for good. And then later on, he went to Belgium. While he was in Belgium, however, he put together Sexual Healing, which turned out to be one of the biggest hits of his career.
Sexual Healing was exactly what it said. It was about his lifelong reconciliation and confusion that his life brought, between pain and pleasure, between what's social and unsocial. He confronted all of these issues on Sexual Healing.
So here he is, hit song, new record contract with CBS. He ends 3 years of hiding out somewhere. He comes back to America, but by now he's totally hooked on drugs and still completely impossible with love relationships.
Even with the comeback, he still was so paranoid and so distrustful of everybody around him. No matter what was going on in his life, the unhappiness in his personal life or at work, none of it really mattered on that day, April 1st, 1984.
April 1st, he went to visit his parents in Los Angeles, who I'm assuming lived there because of Marvin's career. You have to think that something really, really painful, something old, who knows, part of their family history was brought up to lead them to what eventually happened on that night.
You know, the police reports state, if you read them still, that Marvin Gaye was in the house when Marvin Gaye Sr. abused his mother. When Marvin Gaye Jr. heard these words, they had a huge impact on him.
Things got so out of hand that he ended up physically attacking his father. Before it was all over, Marvin Gaye Sr. shot his own son dead 1 day before his 45th birthday.
And as if all that needs further irony, the gun was a gift that Marvin Jr. gave to his father 4 months earlier. It was something kind of almost like out of Greek tragedy. It's a strange struggle between this father and son.
Ever since his passing, his music has become more powerful and more respected. Only after someone passes away and we can reflect on the work that he did, we realize just how brilliant he was.
And sometimes when an artist passes on, there is this sympathy elevation that seems to occur, but not with Marvin Gaye.
Marvin Gaye was the real thing, and I think that a lot of people realized that before he died. Now when young people hear his music, they can hear the sincerity, but I think they can also sense the struggle that was within him.
There's a lot of joy in his work, and his music will always bring joy to a lot of people. Turn on the radio. Talk to people who really know what music is about. Marvin Gaye's still alive.